Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 13 of Private and Listed. Today, I'm joined by a long term colleague and friend of mine, Tim Collins. Tim is the former CEO of DCH Auriga in Hong Kong and across Asia, and he's run many businesses across the region. I thought I'd been away for a long time, living and working in Asia for 20 years, but Tim's outdone me significantly. So, welcome to the podcast, Tim.
Great to be with you, Jamie. Thanks very much for inviting me on. It's a pleasure to hear your voice and share some time with you this afternoon.
Thanks, Tim. You've been back almost a year now, or probably about a year now. How does it feel, and what made you come back here?
Just about spot on to the year. June last year, I think we came back, and there's some similarities, but a lot of differences, of course. And whilst we've been up and down quite regularly to see family and various things, I haven't actually lived in Australia since 1997. So you can imagine that, clearly things are very, very different than when I left. And, I'm still can recall that I think back then there wasn't even a GST, Jamie. So things have certainly changed here in that context.
I think it came in much after that.
Yeah, it probably did. But it's lovely to be back and to answer your question. In some of it's driven by family, and at 56, I did have an opportunity to come back and be able to spend a bit of time with aging parents, and I've got two, younger boys, I should say, but they're both young men now, of course, and one of them's just graduated with his masters, and the other one's just started the other end at RMIT here in Melbourne. So some of it was family, some of it's education, and also an opportunity, I thought, to come back here and take all those experiences over that period of time and see if there weren't things that we couldn't help other companies with down here as well. And in that, I've formed a small group of shareholders we've got together, and there's 6 of us now, finding our way in the world in Melbourne and doing some interesting things now already, helping family-run businesses and small corporatised businesses with their strategies and plans for Asia, but also rest of the world, and of course here domestically in Australia too. So it's wonderful. It's been quite a nice homecoming in that sense. So thank you.
Yeah, that's great. I hope your kids are enjoying having you back. What about? Can you give listeners some context for the types of industries that you've run and the countries that you've run them across?
Yeah, well, I was very fortunate. I mean, I started with an FMCG group, very, very well known, of course, in Australia, Cadbury Schweppes. And I was actually living in Brisbane in 1991 when I first joined them. Basically, it was really my first job. And I had 6 years up there in Brisbane with them, and then moved on to Jakarta in Indonesia in 1997. And that was probably, I guess thinking would have been maybe a 2 or 3 year stint, and then maybe come back home. As it turns out with these things, sometimes they evolve, and I was very fortunate that things were going okay career-wise as well. So they, for good or bad behaviour, I guess they kept me up there a little bit longer. And after about 6 years in Asia, I spent 3.5 in Jakarta, and then went up to Hong Kong and managed Hong Kong and Taiwan for Cadbury Schweppes. I made a move across to Lee and Fung Group, and I think that was towards the end of 2003, 2004, and kept rolling. And, through them, I guess it opened up a new world for me, and that was the world of healthcare as an industry, which I hadn't been, part of up until that point. And so I ran an FMCG and a healthcare business with them for the next 12 years. And I was then part of a sale. Lee and Fung decided to sell our business on to CITIC Group and a holding company under the name of DCH. And, I continued to run that platform, and then expanded that platform with their FMCG and logistics businesses, which fell in under my remit. And we had sort of an FMCG, healthcare and logistics platform across 11 countries in Asia, and nearly 4,000 people on the team. So it was a tremendous amount of growth in a 28-year period being offshore, and most of it very, very enjoyable, I must say. So it was a great time. But very fortunate to have worked across industries, and really learnt a tremendous amount from the teams that I worked with, the companies that I was working for, of course, and the very rich list of customers that we had across the region. We literally had a who's who of FMCG and healthcare groups that we supported across Asia. So it was a wonderful time.
Just in that context, you have had a very storied and celebrated career. So congratulations. What are the nuances that you've seen from working between private and listed companies? That's a play on the podcast, but you've worked for both. You've acquired private businesses and listed businesses. But how did you feel working for both and operating in both those sectors?
Yeah, well, running businesses has, generally there's some similarities, of course, and respective in industries too. Once you've sort of reached the general management level, there's some key things that run true across industry and country in that sense. So whether that's a public or private situation, that's really important, I find, either side of that equation. So if you're listed, the accountability is a little more obvious, and obviously anyone who's interested in you can pick up your half or your annuals and get a pretty good idea of, not just your financial performance, but your commentary particularly is important as a listed company in terms of making sure you're guiding your shareholders and your market respectively. Whereas private, you probably do have some advantages in getting yourself fit and ready if you wanted to ever divest, sell, or acquire yourself into something bigger, or perhaps even have an ambition to IPO your business yourself. So I think having worked both sides, depending on the situation, the business that you're working on, both of those scenarios have their pros and cons based on the performance of your business and the respective period of time that you're dealing with it. So I've seen and been able to work through the advantages of both sides of that. And obviously when you're listed and things are going well, the market tends to cheer you on a little, whereas privately you don't quite have the audience. But invariably you can still have stakeholders that have either a capital interest in the performance of a private company, or, this is often the case, you could be working for a family office, and the family have obviously interests in the performance of the business too. So I've been very lucky that I've worked both sides and multiple industries at that point.
I think we both talk about mergers and acquisitions. We've done it over the years, but would you agree with me on this, or I'd like your take on this for listeners to get, is that it's just easier to manage up, manage down, or make a decision in a private company in terms of an acquisition or a divestiture. It's just quicker than you can make the same decisions in a listed enterprise, but the time to get a result is longer. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I can understand where you're coming from there. I think defining what might be more of the priority in the results area. I think in the private side, you get a little bit more, I wouldn't say latitude, but I think you do have an opportunity there to, as I said earlier, like get a business ready for what ultimately I think is still a very good test of a good business. And for anyone who, harbours the ambition to model their business and have it in a shape or form that would be attractive to investors, whether it remains private or it goes through a public domain, getting your business in shape is a big part of that. And I know, Jamie, you've done some great. I think there's at least one or two of your earlier podcasts where I listened in and I heard you talk about that specific issue, particularly for family-owned businesses, because they can be a little less corporate experienced or orientated, and being ready for that is a big step up sometimes for people to get their arms and wrap themselves around those sorts of expectations, if you like, but also all the governance and compliance that comes with it. So, I think some of the things that you talked about in those earlier podcasts really hits on that key point, right? Getting ready and making sure that you've got the information prepared and presentable is a key component to the health of your business overall. So I think whether it's public, whether it's listed, if you really want to have a good benchmark that you're working towards, it is definitely, in my view, it's about being ready as if you were going to be in front of investors, whether that be a public situation or a private one still.
There's certainly a lot more visibility in public business and accountability for year on year. But how did you navigate managing up and managing down? And the context for that is either acquiring or divesting businesses in country A, country B, country C, which are all different. How did you navigate that over the years?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, if you're sitting in a listed company, I think there's a couple of layers of scrutiny. I mean, you've got your internal objectives and goals and measuring against them. You have market expectations, of course, and investor expectations, and they'll often be present at either investor relations roadshows, so that's typically done in the bank boardroom, or the funds boardroom, where you may, for key strategic stakeholders, give them one-on-one presentations as well as public ones to your public shareholding at your annual or your half-yearly report. So, I think it's very important in terms of managing that. But the third element that listed companies provide the opportunity to adhere to governance and compliance, of course, is through the listed status itself. So you've got a whole set of rules and regulations that we all are bound by in terms of our reporting standards, etc., for the listed bourses that you're on. So I would say that you've got an extra level of, as you call it, transparency, and you have to make sure that your teams as well as your systems are there to support you in making sure that is clear. One thing that any investor doesn't like typically is just surprises. And the moment if you leave things and deliver a surprise, I think that's usually when, I shouldn't say a surprise to the upside, of course, is welcome, but a surprise in terms of any risks is something that requires a different management, and obviously there's rules and regulations about how you are required to declare those sorts of events should they be relevant to do so. So,
I think it's a good point. Investors they just don't want surprises. They can manage good results and bad results, and sophisticated investors obviously go across a number of things. But surprises and managing is the same, right? You can say to your staff, just don't surprise me. If something's bad, let me know about it and we can deal with it. And I'm sure you had to deal with that quite often across various countries. And you would have, did you rely on, Tim, on your people on the ground in each of those countries, and how much so? You grew throughout your career across all those countries we mentioned earlier, but how did you manage across countries and across businesses, and Did you have a management team in most of these places, and did you rely on them, or how did you do that?
Well, it's a great point about transparency and cultural transparency that I guess you're touching on there, because inherently some markets are just more transparent culturally as well, and I think some cultures, disappointing the boss or bringing bad news is not it's not actually the thing that you tend to bowl up on a Monday morning and are willing to go to confession straight away on. So I think there is an art there in reading people, and that does vary market to market. Some people are very, very good, at playing poker face, and you have to be cognizant that to challenge, particularly challenge publicly, has its risks in certain markets, and your approach to that and how you empathise with the situation. But more importantly, without question, the bottom line for me always came back to whether they were willingly sharing, some of those challenges with you or not. Once you're aware, how you handle and approach that is really important to making sure that you can keep things moving forward. You don't want, a sort of a burial ground and then a pylon, if that makes sense. There is a risk there that if you do sort of create an environment where you only want to hear good news, you don't have channels or methods to support getting the challenges surface through, you can find yourself, knee deep in a position that you don't want to be in relatively quickly, because these businesses tend to be always growing to some extent. They can be good growth and bad growth, but you tend not to have an issue around market growth, etc., across most Asian markets. They're all growing. They've got big populations. They've got market share opportunities. You've got all of those things that are available to you. So you don't typically sit there and say, well, I'm not going to grow the business. It's going to probably be growing. And with that comes all of those risks and challenges. As I said, sometimes sales growth doesn't always mean it's good sales growth. The quality of that revenue may not be right, but it mightn't be as culturally applicable that people actually tell you, even if they know that they're over discounting or doing things with customers that are just getting, volumes and sales, but the quality of the sale is not there. So I've seen a lot of examples of that in that sort of 28-year period being up there. And, you really do need to make sure that you've got the ability to read the room, and that runs both in systems and financial structures, making sure you're over your numbers, but it's also about the people. And fundamentally, just being able to, pick those nuances and cues with the people to know when, it might be time to dig a little deeper and provide support, right? Because at the end of the day, you've still got to move it forward.
That's really insightful context. I often have people say to me, I've got an Asia strategy. And I look at them and I go, you don't have an Asia strategy. You've got a country or a couple of country-specific strategy. Asia is very diverse. And there are different, as we've said, new cultural and regulatory nuances and what have you. But the point that you just made, for anyone that's got a potential, look ahead to grow their business or scale their businesses across Asia, is the way you deal with people in each country and the messages that they're giving you, whether it's about how we market or how we sell something. Very important context that you provided there for people, because it is different, Tim, in every country.
Jamie, it is. And your sources of information, one of the things that, I was in Hong Kong again last week, catching up with, various banks and, acquaintances over that period that we'd been there. And it's very interesting when you go back to some of the old haunts, if you like, from your offices. And I always, this was always a really good indicator to me that when you walked into a site or an office location, I used to always look with my management teams, and the first giveaway usually was someone who was greeting you at the front door. It could be the reception team. It might have even been a tea or a coffee, someone bringing in a tea or a coffee for you. But it's amazing how those relationships and the cues from those relationships tell you a lot about, that culture locally and how accepting it is. So without labouring it, I mean, when you go back last week, one of the things that was great, I used to find the reception and the tea ladies and things like that some of these times had attached to these businesses. A tea lady in Australia would sound like something from probably the 1970s, I guess now. But in Asia, as you know, it's still quite a courtesy to have staff serving as part of the structure when you're addressing customers and other things. And they are remarkably good at giving you some clues as to what's going on in a business locally. So I never walked past them. I always greeted them and made sure that you went around and you could deal with, across the floor as well as, behind closed doors, if you like, for lack of a better term. So, personally, I always thought that was a good insight. I thought good management, good leaders in our countries had that ability to be able to, inspire, if you like, the whole organisation, that it wasn't set just around a sort of a hierarchical structure, if you know what I mean, right? So.
I think that's a pretty cool point. I remember in Hong Kong, I worked in Chung Kong building for quite a while, and Li Kai-shing would come in, obviously under high security every day, but he would talk to the cleaners and the people at the front desk, and he talked to them.
There you go.
And I've never forgotten it.
Yeah.
So, yeah. It's really cool, and I think there's a lot of humility in Asia as well across those things, and you do pick up a lot of signals from people that you wouldn't expect. Most people just go straight to the top, and it's not a criticism, but I did find that people that flew in and flew out that were running businesses from different regions, whether it's Europe or North America, sometimes they didn't have the grace of people that have been on the ground for a long time in Asia and know how to navigate those situations that we just talked about. So it was more, this is how we do it in Europe and this is how we do it in North America, so this is how you should do it here. And it's actually vastly different in Asia, to be honest. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, Jamie. Yeah, I think, the risk is that you may be busy and you think that there's a lot of things that you've got to get done, and you walk past some of these opportunities to just sense the mode. And, I always made a point of at least taking some time out of every trip to have ticked that box with your teams. So, yeah, totally agree. And I can really understand, what you would have seen at Chung Kong Holdings building too, because, it was an art. It was actually an art form that, those senior people still had the ability to bring the whole team along in the journey with them and give them a little bit of respect on that way. So it didn't matter if you're a billionaire, right?
100%. Look, I just want to segue into, I guess, the vestiges and acquisitions. I've got a theme running through the podcast. Obviously, age is a big theme, but there's scaling and transitioning of, I'm talking about baby boomer businesses. A lot of yours were bigger corporate entities, but across the countries of Asia was the consideration in divesting a business that was potentially non-core, or acquiring a business that you thought it would help you scale and roll up in a country. Were they different? How did those conversations come up? Did somebody bring them to you, or did you, as the senior executive, the CEO, go, okay, that's non-core to our healthcare business, I need to move it on, and then, or did you ask somebody else about that? Did they come to you and say this is non-core? How did you manage those sort of things?
Yeah, well, I've had a bit of both, actually. We've had businesses where we've invested and grown. We've grown organic markets without, acquiring assets to get into them. And as you well know, I've been on buy side and sell side of a number of deals through that time up there. Well, I think there's a few key things. I mean, I think I said earlier, I mean, it's really important to get the best people you can to work with. And I think building a really strong management team and having, good crew on the journey with you it's a cliche, I know, but it's very true. And I was given that advice very early in my own career back in Cadbury Schweppes. Our chairman was out from the UK and visited us in Indonesia and also in Hong Kong. And, it was one of the key things he always reminded us. He said, just get the best people you can, right? Work with the best people. And I think they were big believers as an organisation back then, Cadbury, that there was no one that was the smartest in the room. I think the sum total of the room was where the strength lay, and they didn't sort of subscribe to that. There's always got to be someone having the last word kind of thing. It was always a very open dialogue and debate, and I value that. I think you've got to have really good people that give you some diversity of opinion, are willing to speak their mind, irrespective of culture and other things. And you've got to facilitate and make sure that ecosystem's encouraged, when you're having your management reviews or when, just as we said before, when you just walk on the floor. Excuse me. So I think that's part of it. And it really wouldn't matter if it was a listed company or a private company in that context. I think having a really good structure and team around you is not negotiable in that sense in terms of where you want to get to. Probably the second thing across the region is then, trying to understand, as you said, market to market, the little cues are going to shift and they are a bit different. I mentioned earlier, some people have a pretty good poker face on. Others, you can just sort of tell, they can't help and they'll break out in a big smile or whatever it might be to sort of share how they're feeling and thinking about things. But you've still got to create and facilitate an environment that the things that you need to know, you can get to, rather than the things that people, and sometimes, we all have a little bit of a habit of trying to sort of smooth off, if you like, the edges on the harder news or the challenges, and everyone loves to jump on, the wins and the successes. So, I think the art of management there is with your good teams of people is to try and draw out both sides so that good and bad is not so much the issue, it's the not knowing and the surprises that are the issues. And then with everything that I ever did, whether it was buy, sell or whether it was listed time or not, you really had to make sure that you supported your teams with great systems and, common ERP, international accounting standards as a minimum, and then local regulatory compliance and governance, whether it's on accounting side or whether it's, say, in healthcare where, each Ministry of Health market to market had their own set of rules and regulations. You had to make sure that your systems fully supported your operating teams and businesses on the ground and that they were compliant at a local and or a global level for the transparency. The second part to that, of course, is that you need to be good with numbers and be able to spot areas that just don't look like they're aligning the way they should. And that can often be, sometimes it might be the first clue you get to that something else is going on in a business that should or shouldn't be happening. So, I think all of us tend to, if numbers are good, you're like, oh, great, and maybe you become a little bit complacent and enjoy the success a bit. But I always saw it both sides. If things were going well, I would be equally as curious as if things were not meeting the standards and getting to the levels that we'd expected for that business. So I hope that helps. I mean, it's a little bit of a roundabout way of getting there, but I think you've really got to have great people, good systems, be compliant, be very aware of the governance and the regulatory side, market to market, and then make sure that you've got the ability to, if you like, penetrate and draw out information that's going to give you a good sleep every night.
That's good. There's a lot to unpack there. Thank you. When you, as you grew in your roles and you took on more people and more countries, how did you manage up? What was there a skill in managing up? Of, you worked for some big organisations.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Look, I think some of the decisions, particularly early career, like in the 90s, 80s, 90s, I guess maybe that period, where I joined Asia, probably the multinationals had that. Do we go local? Do we have expatriates? How many expatriates do we have in a country? That sort of stuff. So there was, some confidence perhaps as a multinational drawn by having, some translation there from, having an expat team on the ground. But, through the 2000s and, as I'd left Cadbury Schweppes, I think there'd been almost a shift on that. And, it was more about how international your management was, perhaps, because I think part of the skill expectations there were that you weren't just transferable in business skill, you were transferable in cultural skills and in market skills, so that you'd learnt to become more accountable, but also more adaptable to varied experiences and different scales of business, market to market. So I think that was something that I experienced firsthand. And then managing up, I've managed up to sort of the Western side, both from customers and also from stakeholders, and I've also had a long period of time where I was part of Chinese conglomerate and or listed Chinese company structures. So how you manage up there, quite honestly, Jamie, again, there are a whole lot of things that are very similar. And when you're running a business that is essentially there to add value, create value, those sort of metrics pretty much, run true across all of those scenarios. What differs a little, perhaps, is apart from obvious things like translations of languages and how we might, put an acute on certain pronunciations of words and change the meaning of things, which all cultures do. But yeah, I mean, there's clearly differences too that you have to make sure that you can appreciate, respect, and adapt to in the environment and the setting that you're placed in. So you found, I think the best way to describe it is this: no one meeting was probably the same in some ways. So you found that it was constantly changing, and you were fitting, to some extent, around the circumstances that you were in. And it's not to say that you're manufacturing yourself to just an audience, but you certainly had to be aware that how certain things were acceptable in one country or one meeting room, that could be very different, as you move on to the next one. So, I found, in some ways that was quite an enjoyable part of the experience too, because you did learn that these things work here, but they just don't work here. And you're not going to be effective, whether it's managing up or down in the structure, by not being able to sense those things and also to be able to articulate them.
To me, that's music. I think respect for the environment and respect for the culture that you're in is important when you walk into the room, and you've just clearly articulated that. So I'm sure the listeners will find that fantastic. It is. This is an off the cuff question, but is there something that you've done that you're really proud of? You don't have to name the example, but sort of circa. And is there a challenge that you thought, I missed that opportunity? Is there a story that you can convey?
Oh, look, I think probably the proudest thing is that, as you did, Jamie, I mean, to go to Asia, probably thinking it might be 2-3 years. In fact, my first contract, I think, was 2+1. They were the terms of the contract, right? So you didn't really have a horizon much beyond that. I think some of the proudest moments, when you reflect back on that you've come out of your comfort zone in your home, your culture, and what you literally cut your teeth on culturally and from a business sense and a network, gone out into this whole new world of opportunities and being able to do it for as long as we did it. I think you'd feel the same, right? 20 plus years in anyone's sort of measure is something you can be proud of. And, I thoroughly enjoyed, by and large, most of that experience, right? Because you saw good progression for yourself, yes, but you look at the growth and generally the ability that you were having to play a role in positively, influencing people's own careers and lives and livelihoods in many cases. I've run factories across the region, as you know, as well. And, factory floor workers are very dependent on, a business being healthy just for their jobs too. And to be able to create growth for those across all layers in a business structure, I think is one of the more rewarding elements of it. A particular highlight for me, I do remember when I left Jakarta. It was in October of 2000. And, excuse me. And I think there was about 300 people that came to the airport. Now, I wasn't sure whether they were all there to make sure I got on the damn plane and left. But it was a very emotional moment, and I was quite emotional myself, I must say, that the tissues were getting a good workout. But I think when you see something like that, it's not about, differences, is it? It's just a common respect that you've achieved. And I think, when you complete, whether it's an acquisition or a divestment or just a good customer experience, even all of those elements, they can be so rewarding and really positive. So I think to have done that for 28 years and pretty consistently, I mean, I haven't won everything by any stretch of the imagination. I've had my share of mistakes and challenges, as you said, along that journey too. But I think to have done that and to get to where you did over that 28-year period, it's a pretty special moment for me. When I look back now, I feel really positive about that, and that in so many ways you've been able to contribute in a positive way to what you did with the people you worked with. So yeah, it's a bit of a long answer, but yeah, it can be very rewarding, can't it?
It can. I must admit, you're a pretty pragmatic operator, because I can remember over the years there are times when I've tried to get you to acquire businesses that I've been working for, and there's been times when I've tried to pry businesses out of you that you've owned, and it's never been easy. You've always been very pragmatic. But there's a few. I mean, I'm used to advising businesses and mergers and acquisitions, but sometimes you try to use some leverage and say, can you look at this properly, and can you divest this? And you're always pretty pragmatic, Tim. So it's probably, for me, root canal with no anaesthetic, but it's always enjoyable.
Great way of putting it. Well, and hats off to you too, because I think, in fairness, you've always tried to deal with getting fair terms, because you and I both know that if it's too one-sided, it's probably not going to happen. And it's either too far one way that, someone always wants to buy it at the lowest price and the other one always wants to sell at the highest price, for example. And once you move beyond the buy-sell price points, there's a lot more to deals, as you know. And I think that's a great word to describe it, because the pragmatism and knowing that integrations and successful integrations are not always that easy. And there's a whole, as you know, a graveyard of things that should have been but ended up not being. And you don't want to be part of that, actually. So I think you're very good too, in fairness. So thank you for your compliments, but I'll give you one back in that sense, because I think you also give pragmatic advice, whether it's on the buy-sell side. And I think that's important. You've really got to understand what's necessary to get a fair deal and something that's going to provide continuity to respective parties. Once you've sold and moved on, sure, you could always say, well, that chapter's closed. But I don't know too many people that have sold businesses that haven't still had some interest to see how it's still going, if that makes sense, And I've had relationships with some of the deals that I've done and continue to have relationships. In fact, I met with some of the people that I've done deals with and had catch-up lunches, dinners and that last week in Hong Kong for that reason, because there's still a genuine interest from my part to see how they're going and how all the things that we worked on together and, things are still working out okay in that sense. So, to me, that's a really important measure of an M&A. It's not just getting to the point that the actual deal's done, It's how's it done 2 or 3 years later? Is it still holding up?
You've always had a bigger baseball bat than me, Tim. You've always had a much bigger landscape to make a decision in. Mine's always been bringing something to the table. But I do agree with you that owners of businesses, they actually care after it's been sold. It's the price can be matched. You agree on a price, but the chemistry and the dynamics of how you integrate or scale a business or do whatever you want afterwards, the original owner or founder of that business still wants as a legacy for it to perform. No one wants to go to bed and go, oh, I owned that, it went down off the cliff. People want to go, I own that and it's doing really well now. And so I think your point is really good.
Oh, you bet. Yeah.
There's so much more. Yeah. Yeah. Look, I
agree. And you've seen a lot of those sort of businesses, right, where you've had family offices or family-run businesses. And one of the key things that they are concerned with is just that legacy, that it will, still in some shape or form be continuous. I've seen many of those, and I know you work with a number of them too. And it's very important to owners, as part of that transfer that, some of that legacy is going to be carried forward at some shape.
I think we just to finish off, I've really enjoyed this. We could talk for hours and we could do many of these, but in the baby boomer business, or sort of the 62 to 80-year-olds, which I talk about a lot, they've really got to find a way. They don't know that they're not professional buyers and sellers of businesses. You and I have sort of built careers out of doing that, but they want to extricate, see the legacy continue, but they often need some support in how to do that because they've grown the business with their fingernails from a young age, and they've done it well, and their customers know them, and the kids don't necessarily want the businesses. They want to do other things, and the parents probably want the kids to do other things. But it's about being able to transition that business and getting the right advice as to how to do that. I suppose you're looking at that with the group of people that you're with now back here in Australia as well.
Yeah, it's very true. The team, that I'm working with at six figures now, I think the disruption that's going on in Australia, or potential disruption, is going to raise increasingly more of these opportunities for as you said, the people that have sort of had the sleepless nights, they've gone without, just to get the next month through and things like that. I mean, a lot of that's coming up for review, and I think you've been in the box seat of a lot of those things as well yourself. And I do agree. I think sometimes one of the key things that they just want to know that they can still have confidence that continuity will be in some shape or form at least maintained. And you do see a lot of that here. I think there's an incredible depth of good family businesses, as you said, that are reaching that point now where either there's not a baton pass in generation, or there's other things that are driving decisions to make a decision on what the future of the business is going to look like. And I know some of your podcasts do cover the topics of getting ready for that process as well. That's really important. But to your point, I think as an owner, and for all that period of time that you vested in getting that business to where it is, the last thing you want to do is see it go somewhere and then almost disappear. And not mean so much. So, it's a really good point, very emotional point, I think, for an owner to have to transition.
It is, and just to finish off, it goes back to what you said earlier. You've got to have good advice around you. I mean, I've said it on one of the previous podcasts. If somebody tells you your business is worth 8 or 10x, and they're not an informed person, then it sets expectations in your mind, and you never recover from it. So you need to get proper advice where you can get a handle on what is the value you've created and how can that be rolled up into something else, rather than grandiose, go and have a coffee with someone and go, oh, look, 10x. It just doesn't work like that. I don't think it does.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think of all my experiences, I think there was only one where I was involved where the valuation was stretched, to put it politely, I guess, and then living up to that expectation, that really can be quite a challenge. So, I was rather fortunate that in the situation we were in, we managed to get through that and seriously create value for, the change of control. But it's not always the best thing to sell, to your point, like go for that really high multiple, but then, the premium's been paid. And, on the buy side, the last thing they want to do is start impairing things by year 2, year 3. It doesn't look too good. So to that point we made about how you've always operated, I think being fair, reasonable is sensible, and it's probably got a fairer basis for both parties to make sure that the business can continue to prosper and grow. Sometimes when it's a little bit too one-sided, as we mentioned, you can create some pretty significant stress not too long after the deal closure itself. The cracks can appear. So I really support what you've done in that sense, and how you're communicating to an audience now of the importance of just being realistic about what you really want out of the deal. And we all value money, we get that, but we also value what we've built, and making sure it goes to the right place and has the opportunity to continue on. A lot to be said in making sure that happens.
It really is an art, not a science, and I think a lot of people, hang it out there that, look, there's a methodology to go through to get a merger and acquisition done, but there's not. The way businesses are run, the people that are involved, the nuances, just the whole operating system, the chemistry. Look, if you don't have chemistry when you get to the final stages of a transaction, it can fall over in the last week or two. But look, I think it's an art, not a science, and you're able to speak to that point a lot better than I am.
Well, that's, as you said, we're closing up, but I have been just recently actually on an advising role for a deal, and it was, interestingly, an Asian buyer, an Australian-based seller, and one of the disconnects, to your point, was they had not actually met the buy-side owner. So they were actually dealing with sort of the management IC team rather than the actual owners, and that's unusual, as you and I both know. So that was the first thing that, my feedback was to this particular seller. I said, well, you probably want to understand why you haven't met the owner yet, because it typically, the relationship and the chemistry has to be there. So as you can imagine, that one didn't, as far as I know, hasn't gone forward. So yeah, it's a really good point you make there.
I'd want to be talking owner to owner, but anyway, or I would advise somebody to be talking owner to owner. I'm sure you did too. Look, I'm grateful. I'm sure the listeners are too, to have had your time today on the podcast. It's really good, Tim, and thank you for your insights, because they're relevant, they're credible, and they're lived experiences, which is what I like to have on the podcast. So thank you for joining today.
Thank you for having me, Jamie, and to the listeners too. I'm sure they're appreciating the sort of things that you're putting out on your podcast, and hopefully they're helping some of them as they go through their own thought processes, and leads up to perhaps what they have in as an ambition for their businesses going forward. So thanks for your time, and it's a bit hard to cram 28 years into 40 minutes.
Sure is. But listen, everybody, thank you for listening to Tim in particular, and thank you for listening to this episode of Private and Listed. If you've got any questions, you can get me at heyjamie@privateandlisted.com. And thank you again, and thanks, Tim, and we'll talk to you later.
Good on you. Thanks, Jamie.